Hi, this is Leonard from Kosmic Sound, and we are here looking at the brand new System 8 plug-out synthesizer from Roland. This is the latest synthesizer in the IRA product lineup, which have been around for a couple of years now. So far we've had the TR8, the TB3, the VT3, and of course the System 1. The technology that goes into these is Roland's ACB technology, or analog circuit behavior. It's a component modeling system, so whereas a lot of other virtual analogs will model waveforms, they model the components of original hardware. The other genius of these products is the plug-out system. So you can see here, if we just quickly look down at the panel, we have got 4 different options for synthesizers that we can play. We have the System 8 model, which is just your standard setup. Then, and this is the really special part, we have the Jupiter 8, which is built into this machine. We have the Juno 106 that will be built into this machine, but not in the version I currently have here. And we can also add a third one. You can buy more of the plug-out synthesizers from Roland directly. It's also great in the sense that you can integrate these with your DAW setup very easily, and you have plug-in interfaces inside your DAW that will completely mirror what's happening on the synthesizer. Now we've covered those basics, let's take an actual look at this keyboard. I'm going to cover something first. I'm just going to look at the different modes that we can play in before we get into looking at all the things we've got on here. First of all, we have the patch browser over this side. So we have 8 banks of 8 patches. At present, they're actually completely blank, so I can't show you what any of the presets will be like. And the same is true over on the Jupiter 8 system. So if I was to move over to that, I'll just hit plug out 1. And you can see these are actually completely blank at this point. There's nothing there. So I'm going to go back to System 8. And let's just take a quick look at the different performance modes. Now, you have 2 layers that you can use on this keyboard. I should mention before that, this is an 8-voice synthesizer, and when you move into performance mode, it splits that into 2 layers of 4 voices. Again, I can't really show you any presets because there are none in here, but what we have is an upper and a lower section, so I can select which one I want to control by either pressing upper or lower, and I can turn on the upper and the lower as well. There's a few options we can set for this as well, so if I jump into the menu here, so performance edit, if I move in there, what I can do is actually change this to single mode or dual mode. The dual mode, of course, giving you the upper or lower. I can then move across. I've got some levels, part balance. There's all our tempos, sequences. So there's a heap of options in there. If I'm going to jump back again, and I'm going to move over to part edit, and we have transpose settings independent for each one. So if I actually turn both of these on, see, I can retune one of the instruments. At the moment you can see I'm controlling the upper one because we've got the U there. I can move over to the lower. Let's move across. We've got fine tune and everything as well. The other thing we can do is set the range for these, so you can actually create a split if you want to do that. That's pretty much the performance mode. Let's move back into patch mode, and this is just playing a single patch, and like I said, you have 8 voices now that you can use. Before we move into any of the actual programming of this machine, let's have a look at a couple of other things we've got on here. So, different modes. So right now I'm in poly mode, so I can play chords. Mono mode, so we only have 1 note, and we can also move into unison mode, which stacks all the 8 voices up onto each note. So let's move back into poly mode. A few other things we've got on here. So this is the mode you'll probably use it in the most if you're not actually using presets. So we'll jump into manual mode, and then what this does is actually changes the synth sound to whatever's being reflected or whatever's been set up on your main control section there. Other things we have here, there's tempo sync, and that's for the arpeggiator over here, the sequencer here, and of course all the effects which can be tempo synced. All you have to do to sync all of them is hit that one button and they're instantly all locked into your tempo. You have a tempo control right here, so you can set whatever that is. The other thing we have, if we move over to the left side here, we have the arpeggiator. Very easy to use. We hit arpeggio, and we we have that there, we can choose different values. So that runs through from quarter, eighth, 16th, and then 3 triplets. We also have key hold built in, so we can just let that go. And this is great if you want to then start tweaking various things. Another thing that's really cool is this chord memory function. So this can store a single chord. So I've got one in there now. And it's really easy to actually record anything here. If I hold this down, you'll see on the screen here it's showing me what notes are currently stored in there. And then all I have to do is press a chord and you'll see what we've got here. And then that's instantly moved on to any key that you want to play. A couple of other things, we can shift the keyboard up and down and octaves. We have a transpose as well, so you hold this down and then we can transpose by step, by semitone. Finally, we've got velocity off here, so you can completely disable velocity. Not that it's set up to do a lot at the moment. If we move down to the pitch bend and mod wheel here, so you have a choice of how much you want to apply pitch and filter to each of those parameters. So we can move pitch, and this is for the pitch bend. So the filter doesn't actually do a lot in this mode. It's more useful in the Jupiter 8 mode actually. And the same deal with the mod wheel as well. Again, the filter doesn't do a lot, even if you turn it down, not a lot happens at this point. That's pretty much covered all the basic functions of the keyboard. Now let's get into seeing how the synthesizer operates. This is the exciting part. So let's run through quickly what we've got on here. There's a single LFO here. We've got 3 oscillators, so this is a bit different to the System 1. We've got an extra oscillator on here. Here's your mixer, pitch envelope, filter with envelope attached, amp with envelope attached, of course. We've got an effects section over here. So these are primarily distortions on this one, but I'll run through all those a little bit later. Delay and chorus, and finally we've got reverb over there. As I mentioned, if you hit that tempo sync button, all of this, or the delay in particular, will be synced to everything else that's happening on the rest of the keyboard. So let's take a look at these oscillators. I love these. I think the sign of a great synthesizer is when you can effectively make a whole patch with just a single oscillator. And that's certainly possible here. I'll run you through the different waveforms. So we've got saw, of course, square, triangle. They call these just saw 2, square 2, and triangle 2, but I assume they're probably a super saw type thing. We have the 6 different octaves we can use. Then we have a color knob. This is usually just some sort of harmonic modulation. Each one does something a bit different. So on this you're getting pulse width, for example, on the square wave. It's great fun to just play around with because you get all kinds of different effects. So we've got tuning, coarse tune, and that's actually incremental. It's not blended between semitones. We have fine tune. And then we have some modulation options down here. So first of all, we've got cross mod, which is effectively kind of a FM that uses oscillator 2, so we can add some of that in. And even though I've got oscillator 2 down here, it's almost like a ring modulation effect in some ways as well. So you can see I can affect the quality of that with oscillator 2. Then looking at these modulation options, so we can either do things manually, in which case we'd use this color knob. We have got LFO modulation, so particularly if we want to go, let's say for example, so we can get the Reese bass sound. If we wanted to do it that way, we can also use the pitch envelope, and this is another thing I really like about this keyboard. If we're not going to use the pitch envelope to control the pitch, we've basically scored another envelope that we can use here. So I'm going to set that to pitch envelope. So other than that, we can also, of course, use the filter envelope, the amp envelope, and we can also use oscillator 3 as a modulation source, which is great because we've got something that moves up into the audio range. So let's give that a shot. So you'll notice as I change this, we'll get some different effects. So the really interesting thing on here is this variation knob. I'm not actually totally sure what it does because it's not in the manual that I have. It says it's in a reference manual, which at this stage I didn't have, but it does. Again, it seems to be some sort of harmonic variation. So let's move there. So that's number 1. It's number 2. It seems to it's some sort of modulated version of the oscillator. So, but it gives you some really interesting effects that you can get. Bit much. Just move the filter down a bit again. If I move that, so we need a little bit more of the top harmonics in because that's primarily where the change is. You notice it especially when you use this color knob. So you can really create quite an interesting moving sort of patch with just using this single oscillator. If we look at the second oscillator now, we've got pretty much all the same things on there. We've got the variation on that as well, so we can also, let's dial some of this in. We could look at even using the LFO to control that. Great for experimental effects as well, or for film scoring. Absolutely perfect synthesizer for any of those tasks. Now if we just set this back to normal, what we've also got in here is ring modulation, so we can set that there. As I move the tune, we can affect that. And we've also got oscillator sync as well, so let's turn that on. So for anyone not familiar, what oscillator sync does is it resets the phase of the second oscillator when the phase ticks over of the first oscillator back to the 0 point. And what that means is when we move the tune, we don't actually get a change in pitch, we just get a change in quality as the first oscillator forces the second oscillator to re-trigger. So if we turn that off again, let's move over to the third oscillator. Now one thing you'll notice about the first 2 oscillators, there's no sine wave on them. So what the third oscillator does is give you that sine wave. So we have one here, let's turn all that down. So we've got sines there. What we can also do is drop that 1 octave if you want to use that for as a sub oscillator. We've also got 2 octaves on there. And then we move to the other side, we have a triangle wave. And then we have triangle octave lower, triangle 2 octaves lower. And we can also color this as well. So you'll see we had some top harmonics there. We'll move that filter up. Tune knob on here as well. That's just 1 octave. And then if we actually start blending all these in, we can start getting some interesting textures. There we go, back in tune. So you could sort of play around with this a bit, and this is without having used a filter or anything really yet. So I spent quite a long time just sort of playing around with this to see what kind of effects I can get. And you can get some beautiful warm pads. We'll add a bit of release time here. again, I've found just by playing with these, especially for experimental music, you can find some really quite interesting effects. Okay, let's move on now. I'm just going to reset these back to something a bit more normal. Let's go there. Let's talk about this filter now. I actually love this filter. It self-oscillates very easily, so I can actually play the filter. So you can hear now the filter's self-oscillating. If I move the key up, I can actually play that filter, and it's really nice and clean as well. It's not actually sort of blasting your ears out like can happen with filters in self-oscillation. It's probably a good time as well to mention this GRF that you can see pressed on there. That is stands for gripper. This knob is actually higher resolution, so you get much finer control than you would with most of the other knobs on here. The other place you find it is on the rate knob for the LFO. So let's just take a listen to what we can do with the filter with some oscillators in. So we've got a couple of different modes, and I'm just going to return that. So 24 dB, 18 dB, 12 dB low pass, same up there on the high pass side. We also have a built-in high pass filter as well. So it's not as extreme as what you'd expect from the main high pass filter, but it can sort of have a bit of the low end out. We can add velocity sensitivity to the filter as well if need be. Your envelope, again, pretty standard. So what we can do here, let's just even turn this on for this bit. Increase the tempo a little bit. Can use that negative as well. We also have the variation on here as well. Once again, some really awesome kind of experimental effects. Bear in mind, this is just using a couple of oscillators and a filter. We haven't used any effects or anything on there yet. Pitch envelope as well, so we can actually use that on pitch if we wanted to as well. Filter envelope doing that. There we go. But as I said, what I really like about that, you don't have to use the pitch envelope as the pitch envelope. It's great as a modulation source for these oscillators as well. The last one I haven't mentioned on the mixer is your noise. So again, pretty standard white noise. We can also change to pink noise. Keep it right up. And probably the other thing I need to mention at this point as well, we've got Portamento over here as well. At the moment it's in legato mode, so if you play a note by itself, no Portamento. If you play another note while you've got one held down, you get Portamento. So we can also just have it as standard there on every single note. Let's move over to the effects section now. So we've got three different parts here. So the first one, most of these are different types of distortion. We've got overdrive, one that's just called distortion. This one's called metal. We've got fuzz. Then we have got a crusher. And finally we've got a phaser, which is kind of the odd one out on there. I'll just give you a bit of a... So that's your phaser. We've got a tone knob here. This basically controls a parameter of each sound, of each effect. The crusher. Fuzz. Metal. Once again, I love that these are great for kind of experimental textures. They're absolutely perfect synth for doing soundtrack work. So this is just your fuzz. Next one we've got over is distortion. A lot of top end on that one, and then here's your basic overdrive. Let's move over next to the delay chorus section. So again, this is really important to note that I've got tempo sync on. You can turn it off if you don't want tempo sync. Let's go back to my arpeggiator. And we can hear, let's just get this a little bit shorter so we can hear the delay on here. Alright, so standard delay. We've got different time values. Something that's really cool, I think, is this little screen here. It's a very simple little thing, but it gives you perfect feedback of what you're doing with whatever you touch. So let's move into tempo sync. Now you'll see we're actually getting rhythmic values. Levels, basically, you're adding your wet signal. Next one over is called pan. What this is really a stereo delay. So you'll get it moving from left to right. Now we have two forms of chorus. Tempo sync doesn't matter for this, obviously, because it's a very short time anyway. Second chorus. Then we've got a flanger. And then finally we've got a combination of delay and chorus. This is really nice actually, this effect. Especially when you combine it with a little bit of a reverb from over here. So let's run through these. We've got ambience, it's the first one there. Time control for that. And we've got room, so room reverb. Hall, so two of those. Plate reverb. And then finally modulation, which can do some interesting things as well. So a mod reverb, so you can get it down to really short times. And that is the effects section. The last major thing to show you on here is now the step sequencer. To use this, as I mentioned initially, if you're in patch mode and you're not in manual mode, this becomes the way that you can select your patches, 8 banks of 8 patches. So you don't even have to be in manual mode, you can arm it from here. I'm going to move back into manual mode so I can use the sound I've made. We go into edit, and we've got some different controls on here. So scale, kind of similar to an arpeggiator, play direction, we've got gate time. We can also add some shuffle as well. I've already got something programmed in here, so I'll just play that. So just before we show you how to do it. So you see the 16 steps run. We can change the timing of those. And this is of course linked to the tempo as well, if you need to change the tempo. We've got different options for playing direction. I love this as well because you can add some really good variation. This one's going to go backwards and forwards. So this one's kind of a little bit random, but it stays within a range. And then we've got full random. Final one there's on key trigger. So it's going to wait for you to press a key. So to get the actual sequences in there, it's really easy. All you need to do, so there's two ways you can do it. You can either record it in real time, or the step sequencer way is also really easy. So you just go into step record mode. First one lights up. And then we've got a sequence in there. Off we go. And then if you want to save that, then you just hold this down. We hit write. So yes, we want to write that. And then it'll ask you if you're really sure, and you say yes. That's now written in there. The other thing as well, if you're in performance mode, And we're going to go into edit mode here. So I've still got that in there, which I can use with my performance mode as well. Now that we've covered everything that's on here, I'm going to move over now to show you the other sounds that we have in here. At the time of making this video, the Juno 106 is not actually in here. So if I hit that, we get coming soon. So let's move it over to the Jupiter 8. As I also said, we don't have presets in there, so we've got to jump over to manual. Now, this is exactly the same settings that I've got from my other patch, so we can even do what we did before and set an arpeggio. What you will notice is that not everything's illuminated, and that's exactly the same as with the System 1. Anything which is not present for each model simply doesn't light up. And the other thing is we've got the little screen here, so where things are different, we still get feedback. So in particular, let's have a look at just one oscillator. So it's telling you here what we've got. Now see, this is a different one here. So instead of saw 2, what we have is sine. We've got square over here, which is as opposed to pulse. And then finally we've got noise instead of the second triangle. And you'll notice here that noise is disabled. Like I said, the screen is really good because it gives you feedback of what's happening. So here we've got PWM depth. And that doesn't change. So on the other, in the System 8 model, that knob did different things. But on here, if I'm not on that, if I'm not on the pulse wave, that knob doesn't really do anything. Everything else is pretty much the same. The sound is different. That's probably the major thing I noticed. So a little bit of pitch mod here. Yeah, we'll set that's pretty good. Maybe get a little bit of filter modulation on this as well. Maybe still a touch. The pitch is actually really sensitive if you're trying to get a little bit of a warble into it. You got to be very careful with only very tiny movements, otherwise you start to get something which is a little bit, can be a little bit out there. Now let's have a look at the connections on the back of the synth. First of all, you've got your headphones. The next thing over, we've got our stereo output, or just the left if you want to send that out in mono. Bear in mind, if you want to use the delays and reverbs, it's best to run this in stereo. Next to over, we've got our inputs, so you can run either a stereo source or a mono audio source through there as well. If we switch it over to mic, we can run a microphone through there, and that also works with the built-in vocoder. Next over, we've got our gate out and CV out, so we can use the synth to control external hardware, analog hardware. We've also got a trigger in, which can receive a trigger pulse to control the arpeggiator. Next over, we've got our 2 pedal controls for your sustain and expression. Then over the other side, we've got an SD card slot, and we can use this for backing up patches from the synth, so you don't lose anything. We've also got MIDI in out, and then USB, which can either be used as an audio interface, which is 2496, or also for sending and receiving MIDI. Finally, just a simple DC in with the power adapter that's included in our power switch. There's also a ground screw if you have any audio issues and you need to remove some noise. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to share some final thoughts about who this synthesizer is for. And I think it's for a couple of different types of people. If you have already established a studio and you already have pieces of hardware in there, I think this synth would still be a great addition, even if only because of the plug-out models that you can add to it. I think a really important thing to mention is if you're new to hardware synthesis, if you've used software only, or even if you're just starting out and you want to learn how to use a synthesizer, a proper synthesizer, rather than something with just a bunch of presets in it, this is the absolute perfect synthesizer for you. If you think about the plug-out system, we can store 3 plug-outs in here, and we can also buy more and run them on the computer as well. So it gives you so much versatility to be able to run so many different synthesizers just with one keyboard. And I think that's a wonderful point about this synth. When you sit in front of it, you're sort of struck by the options that are on there, and then you realize you can switch this over and turn it into a completely different model. And I think for me, in the recent years anyway, this has probably been my favourite synth that I've used. I think if you're in the market for a new synth, you definitely want to get down and have a play of this and think very seriously about adding one of these to your studio. We've been talking about the new Roland System 8 plug-out synthesizer. If you'd like more information about this, you can come and see us in store. Like us on Facebook or check us out online at cosmic.com.au.
No matter what you play or want to learn, Australia's leading musical instrument retailer Kosmic Sound offers a range of guitar, bass, DJ, high-tech, drum and PA equipment to suit your needs. Check us out online at cosmic.com.au.